Hello. Good afternoon, everyone in the East. Good morning to those of you in the western part of Canada. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here with you today and to be here with this distinguished panel of experts and members of Parliament. So people who know what they're talking about and also who have the power to put that expertise into action. We're here to discuss an incredibly important topic, which is of great national importance, political importance, but also personal importance to our panelists. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Daniel Bernhard. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. We are a citizens group that stands for Canadian culture and democracy on air and online. And we are here to host this event today because we believe that decency and democracy are fundamental characteristics of Canadian culture. And so this topic is really germane to our supporters across Canada and to our team here at Friends. I'd like to thank our partners in hosting this event, the Samara Centre for Democracy, and I'm glad that Adelina is here representing them. I'd also like to welcome Professor Heidi Tworek and Chris Tenove from the University of British Columbia, who've published a fantastic paper being trolled on the campaign trail, which will form the basis of our discussion today. And I'd also like to welcome our distinguished guests, members of Parliament, Charlie Angus, Bob Zimmer, and Iqra Khalid, who are here to offer not only their expertise, and make no mistake, they are experts in this subject matter, but also their personal experience and perhaps shed some light on the way forward for Canada and for our democracy. So before I proceed and ask Adelina to join us and give some opening thoughts about Samara's interest in hosting this, I would just like to remind all of our panelists to please do better than I just did, and please speak slowly and clearly. This event is being interpreted simultaneously for our Francophone audience, so please be kind to the interpreters or I will suffer their wrath. So it's one of those do as I say, not as I do moments, and I promise to keep the rule myself. Pour nos spectateurs francophones, nous sommes disponibles à prendre vos questions. Vous pouvez poser votre question dans la section en bas en français. Nous avons des collègues francophones qui peuvent prendre vos questions. Moi, je vais les traduire et les poser aux panélistes. La réponse peut être livrée en anglais, mais la traduction sera présente pour vous. Donc, cet événement est pratiquement complètement bilingue. For everyone else, this event is meant to be interactive, so please post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. For those of you who are here on a computer and not on a telephone, you can see the Q&A function. Please pose your questions there and we will get to them as soon as we can. One final word, if you'd like to stay in touch with the Friends or keep in touch of this with us on this subject matter, feel free to follow us on Twitter at FriendsCB or me personally at SendInTheWolf. And you can also view our research on this subject at friends.ca/platform for harm. We'll maybe talk about that later, but today is not for our research, it is for UBC. And before we get there, let us turn to Samara. Adelina, if you have just a moment, please, about why Samara is here to host today.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. For those who are unfamiliar with the Samara Centre, we are a nonpartisan charity dedicated to strengthening Canada's democracy. And so we produce action-oriented research that uncovers the evidence and reforms needed to make Canadian politics more accessible, more responsible, and inclusive. So I'd especially like to thank Sarah Andrews from Friends of Canadian Broadcasting for setting this up today, and all of the panelists for taking part. So early in the pandemic, the Samara Centre held a Zoom webinar with political interns, and about 20 minutes in, someone Zoom bombed us. It wasn't targeted, as far as I know, it was completely random that someone showed up. They played loud music, they drew some crude images on the screen, and we were able to shut it off in seconds. So in theory, being able to connect online is an amazing thing for democracy. But in practice, things have gone wrong. We behave differently online. We converse on social media in a much more angry way than offline. And harassment and extremism thrive in this environment. So blocking someone from a Zoom conversation is something that works temporarily, but it doesn't tackle the issues that now plague the digital public sphere. A 2019 study of 54 countries found Canadians are the most likely among all the countries to see social media as damaging to democracy. And the research supports public opinion on this one. Incivility online has real costs to the health of our democracy. It can turn people off politics, both offline and online. It disproportionately affects groups already underrepresented in politics. It's making polarization worse. You know, incivility erodes our trust in one another and causes us to have a greater dislike for people from other parties or other ideologies. And it even makes us more vulnerable to other manipulation by harmful online actors, which can include, you know, foreign actors who take advantage of the incivility online, often during elections, of course. So most governments are moving towards regulating social media, but the initiatives differ in the severity, you know, and effectiveness, and tricky questions remain, including how to reduce harmful behavior while also allowing for free political expression, you know, how to treat social media under the law. And, you know, do we need new laws or new ways to enforce existing laws? And whether or how to bring algorithms under public control. So the same study that found that Canadians were most worried about the effects of social media also found that only 40% of them want more regulation of content shared on social media. So whatever solution Canada comes up with, it will be an uphill battle to get the public on board. But having cross-partisan conversations like the one we're having today, backed with strong research, is a necessary step forward towards a solution. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing and learning from all participants today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adelina, and thanks again to Samara for co-hosting this event with us. Une note de plus pour nos amis francophones. Vous pouvez entendre la version interprétée et en français en appuyant le bouton de traduction en bas. Il y a un bouton à côté du chat et du bouton pour poser vos questions, où vous pouvez choisir votre langue préférée et la version française sera là pour vous. Thank you again. Before I get to the main event of discussion with our members of parliament who are waiting so kindly here in the wings, I'd like to turn it over to Chris from the University of British Columbia. Chris and Professor Tworek, who will join in the discussion a little bit later, have done some really fascinating empirical research about the impact of social media or the use of social media politically and the impact on candidates for public office during the 2019 election. So Chris, floor is yours for 5 minutes. If you could give us the highlights of your research, and then we'll get into the implications. And I'm sure if there's anything that's missed, we'll be able to catch up during the Q&A. So over to you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And I'm happy to be a warm-up act today. I'm honored to be joining you from Vancouver and from the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples here. And thank you also to the organizers. Pardon me here a second. There we go. So what I want to do is just give a quick snapshot of this report that Daniel mentioned that Heidi and I wrote and researched along with some colleagues at UBC and some other universities. To do this study, what we did is we interviewed 31 candidates who ran in the candidates or their campaign staff who ran in the 2019 federal election, as well as about a dozen other elected officials at other levels of government. And then we also did an analysis of over 1 million tweets that were English language tweets that were directed at candidates during that 2019 election. And we used an algorithm to categorize these tweets on a scale from positive to what we call high negativity. So here's what we saw. As you can see there, about 1% are what we call high negativity tweets, and those are threatening or hateful or denigrating. About 15% are medium negativity tweets, and those are usually explicit insults. And about 25% are what we call low negativity, which are dismissive or somewhat disrespectful. So you can see those categories of negative tweets and then compare them to just 7% that are positive. So I think that gives you a sense of the tenor, or you might say the toxicity of online discourse during an election. So we focused on the abusive tweets, which are the high negativity and medium negativity categories, to see who were these being targeted at. And what we found is that a small number of candidates get the majority of abuse. In fact, almost 70% of the abusive messages went towards just these 7 candidates. And you can see those are the 5 national party leaders, plus a couple prominent MPs. By contrast, most of the candidates in our database got less than 30 abusive messages over 2 months, which is still too many, of course, but it gives you a sense that some of the accounts we hear of the torrents of abuse that are indeed directed at a small number of people running for office or in office are not necessarily the experience of everyone. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I should say, even smaller numbers of abusive messages are challenging, especially for candidates who are less prominent, less well-resourced, maybe don't have trained staff to assist them. And also, we are only able to focus on Twitter. And some of the interviewees told us that they got more serious and more frequent abuse on Facebook. We were unable to access that types of Facebook data we would need to investigate this. And I think that's an issue that we might return to later. One finding that surprised us is that we did not see that women or racialized candidates got higher proportions of abuse in general. But every non-white candidate and almost every woman candidate told us that they faced at least some online abuse that attacked their identity. So the issue here is more about content than about frequency, at least in terms of what we saw. Explicitly racist or sexist or homophobic messages make up a very small proportion of content that we saw in our Twitter database, but they have a serious impact. And they do in part because they mirror or even amplify the forms of offline discrimination or threat that people face. And they add just another obstacle to running for office that are already faced by people from less well-represented groups. Furthermore, there are high-profile women and racialized candidates and office holders who do receive tremendous amounts of abuse, and that is interpreted as sending a message to others about what they might face. So that's a very quick snapshot. I'm happy to talk about more of our findings, but I just want to pull out what I think are a few key issues that come from our research that we need to address. One is that there is a small amount of material that is possibly illegal that could perhaps be dealt with through criminal or civil legal mechanisms, but those are going to be slow and costly and often inaccessible for users. So we need to find ways to deal with these small amounts of really poisonous content online. There's a much larger amount of online content that is uncivil or disrespectful or antagonistic. And people may disagree about how problematic it is or whether it should be removed. And we need to think about how to deal with that larger category. But I think that most people do agree that we need to find ways to have healthier online conversations to improve the quality of democracy. And there are lots of different ways to do this, and not only through removing content. So an important thing to think about is design changes that might lead platforms to be more receptive or more likely to promote healthier conversations and encourage productive engagement. And that could include more user tools. And a lot of candidates and politicians told us they wish they had more tools to control their engagements. One that does exist is blocking, but that comes with some real important questions. And we might want to talk about that later as well. And just the last point I'd make is that this isn't just a social media platform problem. Social media are often acting as a mirror, and sometimes a very helpful mirror, for sexism and racism in institutions and more broadly in society. And also a range of organizations, including political parties, play a role in contributing to the toxic discourse and can do more to address it. So that's a quick run through some of what we develop in our report. You can find it online if you're interested. There are lots of ways to address this issue, so I'm really excited to talk about how we might do that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for setting the table for us here today. I see already that questions are coming in. So if you've just joined us, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom. This is an interactive event. We will make it such to the best of our abilities. Et vous pouvez aussi poser vos questions en français. Nous allons les traduire et les répondre aussi. Tout ensemble. So let's turn right now to our guests of honor. Thank you so much for joining us, Bob Zimmer, Conservative Member of Parliament from Northern British Columbia, Charlie Angus, New Democrat from Northern Ontario, and Iqra Khalid from the Greater Toronto Area. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start with you, please, Iqra Khalid. Let's see if you can tell us, what has your experience been? We've just heard from the University of British Columbia that abuse and harassment of political candidates online is pervasive, perhaps not evenly distributed, but it seems like everybody gets some of it. Is dealing with abuse, some of it violent, some of it threatening, other parts of it simply just obnoxious or toxic? Is this now the price of admission to participating in public office?
Thank you so much for that question, Daniel. And thank you to Adelina and Chris for your presentations. That's a really important question, Daniel, and I guess I'll share some of my personal experiences. One message that somebody had sent to me, and I will use blank instead of profanity. He said, "Blank you softly with a chainsaw." And I had read that out in Parliament when I was going through when I tabled a motion to combat Islamophobia, you know, that was amongst tens and thousands of messages that I had received, but I'd also received a lot of positive messages as well, you know, of encouragement, and I think the takeaway that I have, you know, over these past number of years on this topic of combating online hate and to make sure that there is a safe space for people to engage in dialogue, is that it's not an easy task. Obviously, as politicians deal with it on a regular basis, and based on the stats that you had provided, party leaders tend to deal with it a lot more than those that are not party leaders. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're engaging in and making sure that there's a platform for everybody to engage in. And one thing that I've been told by my constituents quite regularly is that they're sometimes fearful of engaging on my social media platforms because they're afraid of being targeted by some of these people that watch the social media platforms and then attack the people that are commenting maybe in a positive way or whichever way on these platforms. But I do have a question, is that how does reporting of tweets, and then I know that a lot of your data had just focused on tweets, how does reporting tweets impact your data? I mean, I know tweets get removed once they're reported and that they're found to be in violation, etc. But you know, like it's the conversation and that balance between free speech and free or safe space is an important one, and politicians are a bit in the thick of it, it would seem.
Well, it looks like we have a question for our researchers from the University of British Columbia. So Chris, Heidi, do you have an answer to that question?
Sure, I can just quickly jump in. That's on what we do about reported messages. So the way we were looking at tweets is that we could see them as soon as they were streaming through Twitter. So if they were subsequently taken down, we still accessed them. So we were seeing kind of the raw, unfiltered stuff. But a lot of the worst messages had been taken down when we tried to find them again sometime later. So Twitter's algorithms or flagging processes are getting things. And of course, we can't see how often people are reporting, but we do know that some candidates found it a very effective way to address problematic material, and some thought that they didn't know enough about whether it was working, or it seemed very inconsistent in its application.
Great. I want to follow that up with a question for you, Charlie. And I should say to everyone watching that I did ask all of the participants here, while they are members of political parties, not to turn this into a partisan slugfest. We could watch Power and Politics later if we feel like it. But for now, we're just discussing personal experiences. But Charlie, partisans are part of the issue. And one of the interesting aspects that I found from the report is that, you know, hyper-partisan users, not necessarily members of the parties, but sometimes their adherents, are really driving this. And it seems to affect all parties, that there are people who hate them and will come after them. So it's not one or the other in particular. I was wondering, what do you make of the role of political parties or their adherents in this problem of aggressivity and abuse online? What's been your experience, both as a potentially a target of it, but also as an observer of people who support you or your colleagues who engage in this type of behavior against opposing parties?
Well, I think that's a really good question, because to me, looking at this, I see three main areas. There is the breakdown of public conversation and discourse, which I think is our personal responsibility. There's a secondary level, which maybe we can get to, on the responsibilities of the platforms in terms of the algorithms. And Bob Zimmer and I did a lot of work on that, the toxicity that is driven by the algorithms of extremism and disinformation that drives people. And then I think there's a third issue, which is on the issue of how do we actually get compliance when we're dealing with police, when we're dealing with the platforms, when we're dealing with actual online threat possibly becoming real. But I would say in terms of this being a nonpartisan issue, there are toxic levels of trollism in every party. And, you know, it's funny for me, I live on the partisan side. I'm always the one who's in the middle of partisan fights. But what I see in terms of the online stuff is a serious breakdown that's starting to occur in terms of how we talk about one another. I never heard 17 years ago people refer to the Prime Minister as a traitor who should be hung. I hear that all the time now from partisans. Or, you know, that the leader of the Conservative Party is a fascist. Well, you know, I never liked Stephen Harper. I didn't call him a fascist. It wasn't a part of a normal conversation. What I do is I call people out and I say, listen, that's, you know, I might not like someone from another party, but they shouldn't get hung. They aren't traitors. They aren't, you know, extremists. They represent the political parties of our country. And it's amazing. I think as the push online to dissolve us, to divide us into more and more firm camps, even when I'll post an article, I'll have someone say, I never read that paper because that paper is left wing or that paper is right wing. I don't read them. That's fake. And so this whole idea of fake news being actually dividing us so we can't even have a conversation. I like to say to people, well, you might not like the editorial policy, but I'm posting an article because it's up for conversation. And I think we have to do a lot better, even with our own people, to say, tone it down a little bit. And to that, I would say that on my own page, I've learned that there are people who come on to start fights. There are people who come on to try and get control of your feed. I had to block them. It's a policy now. If you're on my page to create dissension, if you're on the page to pick fights with people, go someplace else. This is a place for conversation. And I found that since I've started to do that, public conversation on the page has gotten a lot more respectful, and people are more willing to listen to each other, because at the end of the day, we need to have that sense of a public conversation that is still possible, that we can hear each other across. We don't have to agree on each other's politics, but there are elements in every political vision that adds to the whole of who we are as Canadians. So on that level, I'd say that's our responsibility, and our responsibility as citizens engaging to realize that some of these, it might be fun to act like a troll sometimes. You might feel great disrupting, but it can have toxic consequences if it becomes the driver of public conversation, or the disruptor of public conversation.
Interesting. Thanks, Charlie. I do have a question for Bob Zimmer, who's been waiting here patiently, but just quickly, one quick follow-up, maybe just a yes or no, Charlie. So when you do reprimand, I suppose, people who are, generally politically aligned with you, who are uncivil to, the Prime Minister or the leader of the Conservative Party, are you finding that they are responding?
I find that a lot of people do, and the people who don't, well, they're going to probably end up getting kicked off my page sooner or later. So, but I think it's sometimes it's just important to say, hey, step back a bit. It's this isn't, and again, trying to divide region by region, of trying to say things that people know aren't true. They're angry, and anger is okay. People are frustrated, but there are levels where we have to just say, that's not fair. And especially when we're talking about threats of violence, people may just think they're expressing their emotion, but after a while, if we keep using violent imagery for dealing with people we don't like, we end up with what happened with Joe Cox in the UK, where someone will get killed. And that's something I think we have to consider, the possibility that is going to happen.
Bob Zimmer, one of the interesting findings from this report was that, and Chris mentioned it earlier in his opening comments, that there is a distinction between what I've heard described, and I've now started to use this term, between content that is awful but lawful, and content that's just straight up illegal. Thinking of death threats and incitements to violence and things. And I mean, the conversation extends further. The ethics committee is discussing Pornhub right now. And that's also illegal user-generated content for another day. This line is important though, because people have been mean in politics from time immemorial, and I don't believe that anyone thinks it's a good idea to ban that. At the same time, respect is important, and the gatekeeping function that used to protect the conversation to some extent is now completely sidestepped. So where do we draw this line? When we're trying to think about how to tackle this problem, there's the incivility and there's the illegality. They're both problems, but they merit different responses, perhaps. I know this is a question you've thought of a great deal when it comes to content moderation. Maybe you can just tell us where your thoughts are right now about that difference and the impact of those two types of content on people running for political office.
And thanks for the opportunity again, and say hi to my colleagues that are here with me. As Adelina said, she said it's very difficult to tackle because we can see what the problem is. We can see the illegal posts, as you mentioned them, but we also see the offensive comments. I guess the question with the illegal seems obvious. They shouldn't be allowed to be posted, something that you've already described. But one that is political discourse. And this is where it becomes problematic. What I see, we see the social media platforms decide who they're going to listen to and who they're not going to listen to, who they're going to allow to be on their platforms, who they won't allow to be on their platforms. And it becomes a really fine line of, you know, an example would be a candidate makes a claim in a campaign. I could see how truthful that particular claim was. The other person, even one of my colleagues here, could say, well, they could counter that with saying that's not true, but we both could prove it that we're both right. So who decides on who's the fact checker to say who's right in that particular instance, right? If it's something that's obvious, it might be easy, but when we talk about political discourse, it gets to be this gray area, and then who's going to police that? And that's where I guess I can get concerned about the social media platforms policing this themselves. And we've seen many times in our studies, even with our International Grand Committee, they're not very good at it. And I see they're actually trying to do a little bit better, but very concerned that we're giving these social media platforms that are huge tools that and can be directed. We've even seen them becoming weaponized, that they're in the hands of people in boardrooms that might have profit as their motivator, and not necessarily the health of our democracy or the health of our citizens. So very concerned about that particular huge power that those folks hold.
And are you concerned about the discussion going too far?
Oh, absolutely. So, and the way I've thought about this a lot, and again, the challenge is what to do about it. It's one thing to, like, if somebody was saying something harmful to somebody else, absolutely, that should not be allowed. We're talking about Section 7 of our Constitution, right? Everybody has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And if somebody's saying something that's threatening that, that shouldn't be there. But there's another, you know, we can say things that sometimes offend each other. And I think that can be political discourse. And I would use somebody, Chris, I think you brought up racism. I think in our country's gotten a lot better because there's been a discourse about this. It hasn't stayed where it's been 100 years ago. It's because of that public discourse and discussion and you know, rubbing shoulders with guys like Charlie and Iqra in the House of Commons that we've all gotten better. You know, that's and that because that discussion has been allowed to occur. So sometimes it's not always going to be an agreeable discussion, but that discussion needs to occur. So I guess where it crosses the line, I guess, is the question you asked, is when it's harmful to somebody else.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a reminder to please post your questions in the Q&A below. We have about 30 questions so far. Hopefully we can have some more. Our staff are looking at them. Vous pouvez aussi poser vos questions en français. Je suis content d'avoir quelques questions en français parmi les autres. The question, Bob Zimmer, that you raised about how to police this is, of course, a very live one. And you know, for that reason, we are, of course, blessed to have with us not just a member, but the chair of the House of Commons Justice Committee, Ms. Khalid. Now, I know this isn't entirely in front of the committee, but you know, I've written about this in discussions about the current Pornhub scandal, but also in terms of the role of Facebook in helping to facilitate the incitement of violence. I'm not just talking about the Capitol riots, but even in Michigan last year, the people who proposed to kidnap the governor of Michigan because they didn't like her policies towards COVID-19, they put videos of themselves building bombs on Facebook, and they posted progress updates. Facebook says that they take this content very seriously and that they take it down. Kevin Chan spoke to the Heritage Committee a couple of weeks ago, where he talked about all of the great efforts that the company is making to take this stuff down in good faith. And then, of course, the Wall Street Journal reports that 70% of their political groups violate their own terms, and that the executives haven't taken it down because it would be unprofitable to do so. I mean, I was a little bit aghast at the possibility that Facebook's representative in Canada wouldn't tell the truth to Parliament, but alas, crazier things have happened. So this is all in front of you right now, and there is a question of responsibility, and there is a question of responsibility for the platforms. Dealing with safety and civility is one question, but you've received threats. Other people have received death threats. Is there a simpler answer to some of this? Should we just call the police?
Thanks for that, Daniel. And yes, in 2018, our Justice Committee had conducted a very wholesome study into what online hate looks like, its impacts on Canadians, and we put forward some concrete resolutions and recommendations to our government on how we should be combating that. And one of the big questions that we have, and since then, really endeavored to kind of find a solution to, is one that you've raised. What is the level of responsibility to whom to really tone down that violent rhetoric? The way that I see it, I think that as a government, we can, at the very least, really address what is the most obscene, the most harmful, the most insightful type of hatred, and really pursue through our criminal code a framework that already exists to really address and to penalize those people that are inciting that kind of hatred and targeting people, and threatening them. The responsibility of social media platforms, I think, is an important question. We've seen in other countries, especially in Europe and Germany, frameworks that have been created where there are regulations for social media platforms to be held accountable for what their platforms are used for. Now, what we, and I think all Canadians appreciate and respect this, is finding that balance between what is outright, violent, harmful hatred that is being shared on social media platforms versus the other opposite end of it is that safe space for people to engage in what is that really important dialogue. Mm-hmm. I think there are a number of things that I'm a strong proponent of, and one of the things that our report had recommended was in our Human Rights Code. There was previously what is known as a Section 13 that created a civil remedy for individuals that were targeted because of this hate, through social media platforms or online platforms. I personally would like to see this to be reinstated in whatever form to make sure that there is a remedy for an individual that is harmed by the hatred that they receive. Mm-hmm. But with respect to social media platforms, I think that conversation around what is really explicitly hatred, I think we can start with that, and you'd referenced Pornhub, and with that, child exploitation is a huge issue that is existing in Canada and across the world. I think that is a good place for us to start and to start regulating those online platforms where such abuse exists.
Can I just ask you a follow-up question quickly, and then I have one more scripted question, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. You talk about other countries that have regulations. You just said that this is a place to start. You mentioned Pornhub. Now, this is obviously not about civility in politics, but surely we don't need a new law to tell us that trafficking in child pornography is illegal. And when it comes to political violence, threatening death against a candidate, I could send a letter to the editor of the Globe and Mail right now saying that the Prime Minister should be hung, or something to that effect, or that I intend to do so myself even. The editor of the Globe and Mail, though, doesn't have to put that on the front page. And should he elect to do so, he'd go to jail as an accessory to this illegal act. Under long-standing existing Canadian law, he would be liable to do that. So my question for you is, why should Facebook executives, for example, not be subject to the same treatment if their platform is being used to threaten death, violence, again, on the illegal side? Surely we already have laws for dealing with this. Do we need to start somewhere? Haven't we already started?
Well, Daniel, the issue is the safe harbor provisions that we put in place that protect them. When Bob Zimmer and I had Kevin Chan at our first set of hearings, and we asked about the mass killings in Myanmar. And I mean, they were identified by the United Nations of being complicit in mass killings. And they were like, well, we're on a journey. Nobody's perfect. Can you imagine someone saying that in any other time in history and not getting bounced out of the room and maybe slapped in irons? We learned about mass killings in Sri Lanka that were tied to the platforms, mass killings that have happened in Africa. And, you know, the platforms always tell us they're going to do better. We've got this Pornhub study underway, and we're being told, don't worry, we have legislation coming. I've looked at the criminal code. We have as best child pornography law as you can imagine. And yet none of these companies have ever been charged. So why is it? We have to start saying that these safe harbor provisions will not protect when it comes to issues of violence, issues of hate that are meant to create death for people. For example, the Christchurch mosque shooting. If a newspaper had posted these kind of manifestos, they would be charged. And yet Facebook does it and says, oh, sorry, we're going to learn a lesson from it. It's going to come down to the willingness of government to say at a certain point, because these platforms are so powerful, the power to, I think, upend democracy or the power to create mass harms is that much greater. So we need to be able to say there's got to be some accountability mechanisms when we're dealing with that level of abuse and hate. Unfortunately, in Canada, we haven't seen the kind of mass deaths that have occurred in other jurisdictions, but certainly we heard it from our International Grand Committee, from jurisdiction after jurisdiction is dealing with some really severe issues. And the idea that there's this protective bubble around the platforms, that they're just these really cool kids from California still learning how to tinker and make things work, it doesn't cut it anymore.
Okay, I have one more question.
You're absolutely right.
Sorry, go ahead, Iqra Khalid, please.
Thank you. And I don't think that that anybody is giving any leeway to social media platforms. I think it's more of finding a way to regulate effectively. There are models out there, and you know, we do need to hold them to account for a lot of the content that is quite extreme, as I'd said earlier. But we also need to ensure that there's enforcement. We do need to look at that totality of what is our justice system around hate laws, and deal with it in a very effective way. It's one thing to say to Facebook, if you don't take down your post within 24 hours, you're going to get a fine. But at the same time, we need to ensure that we as a government have a mechanism of enforcing that also, and ensuring that that the content that we're saying should be taken down within 24 hours actually falls within those within that realm of being harmful. And I think context and social context has really a big part to play. And until and unless these social media companies actually hire live bodies within our country to look at that data, then I think that enforcement piece of it is really difficult to navigate around. It doesn't mean that it can't be done. It actually absolutely should be done, but it needs to be that kind of give and take on how to get it done and how to ensure that we're enforcing it.
Okay. Sorry, Bob, I'm just going to ask you one question if you like, and then you can squeeze in your answer after that. Thank you very much, Iqra Khalid, for that. And if you're looking for mechanisms for enforcement, you can give me a call. I got some ideas. Bob Zimmer, just one last question to you before we open it up to the audience for questions. You know, the idea behind social media and the political import of social media is that it increases participation. It gives voice to people who may have previously been excluded. Yet, to my knowledge, voting, the percentage of people who vote has not increased. The number of people who participate in political parties has not increased. The number of people who are volunteering on political campaigns has not increased. We see that there is a cost to candidates and to our democracy and to politics associated with people's behavior on social media and the free-for-all that it enables. Are we getting anything in exchange for paying that cost that is of value?
Well, the great part of what social media started out to be was to be the new public forum, but online, right? This was the good thing that I think we'd all acknowledge. I can reach out, and Charlie has mentioned this before. We have very remote ridings and very big geographical ridings that we can reach out to constituents 1,000 miles away easily with a Facebook post. Half of my communications with my constituents are probably on Messenger or some kind of social media communication. So that's the really good part of it. But I think I'm going to just steer it a little bit. I think what needs to be looked at is the algorithms that some of these social media platforms, how they operate. And we talk about that initial conversation used to be, I think, very good. We does, as the old proverb says, iron sharpens iron, right? We would have those conversations. But when we discovered that these social media platforms use algorithms to profit from, so amping up political discourse, getting people more angry at each other makes them more money. That's the bottom line. And that's one of the things that we talk about legislation. One simple thing is algorithmic accountability. What are the algorithms doing? Are they stirring up dissent? Well, yes, they are. We know they are. So why does that keep happening? Because it makes the money. So there's ways to monetize these platforms, I think, that don't need to amp up those problematic areas. We haven't even talked about foreign interference. One thing we saw in the U.S. election, there was interference on the left and the right, and it was from foreign actors that were just stirring up dissent and chaos. Mm-hmm. So some of these Facebook folks, we don't even know if they're real, that might be bots, that are deliberately stirring up dissent just to cause chaos. And the example I use often is that, if I'm sitting in my car and somebody comes and spills a cup of coffee in my lap, that kind of ruins half of my day. Well, these bots or whatever foreign actors do, they spill cups of coffee in all of our laps and cause chaos for us. So anyway, I think there's a lot that could be done on foreign interference and some of the algorithms and many other things, like you said, Daniel, as well. There's ways to just get them to improve, and we haven't really even started with them, chipping away at them yet. Some of the platforms have done a bit on their own, but there's a long ways to go. The last thing I'll say, one thing we learned very early on in our committee work, these social media platforms and big tech are moving at 1,000 miles an hour, and legislation is moving at about 1 mile an hour, and they know it. And they're taking advantage of that slowness of our response to what they're doing, and they're making a whole bunch of money in between. So we have to figure out a way to still preserve that public square where we can have a good conversation between a Liberal, Conservative, and NDP member of Parliament that's very civil, and we actually learn from each other. We need to preserve that part of it, but try and get rid of the other stuff.
Thank you. And referring to your committee, to the Grand Committee and the Canadian Ethics Committee's role in this, I think this was a really impressive demonstration of what Canada can contribute. Your knowledge was really exceptional. And when I attended the Grand Committee meeting in Ottawa in May of 2019, that was a really impressive cross-partisan piece of work, and a model for the world. So thank you for your participation in that. Okay, we are going to go to questions from the audience. They've been coming in fast and furious here. If you would still like to pose a question, please do. Click at the bottom and ask away. I'd like to bring in, for our first question, Professor Tworek, who's been waiting here super patiently.
I've been waiting to hear Heidi, so go Heidi.
It's probably saying, who's this bald guy and his stupid questions? And why can't he ask about the important things? So Heidi, I'm going to put it to you, and I'm going to come back to a question that I raised earlier that someone has posed here. A lot of conversation that is mean or nasty in social media from partisan actors may be okay. It's maybe noxious, it's maybe impolite, but it's not illegal. It's not anything that we would consider banning. However, it does sometimes wind people up who then take their grievances into the real world. And we know, you and I did an event in September with Catherine McKenna, who talked about her family being under police protection as a result of people taking these threats very seriously. So it starts out okay, but you never really know what the knock-on effect is going to be. And so our questioner says, what what rules or guidelines should be considered for politicians, given that it's impossible to control what happens with their commentary after it is put out, even if the original intervention itself is on side?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for organizing. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I would say that this is a multi-pronged problem. So alas, I can't come to you with one silver bullet. And we've already in our conversation, I think, run the gamut from what an individual MP can do, like Charlie Angus, talking about having his own plan for what constitutes for him what I would call, and other researchers like Heidi Tworek call constructive conversation. So not just conversation where we tear each other down, but what constructive conversation means to him, having a plan and communicating that so that if people are blocked or removed, they actually understand why. So that's one level of what we can think about. What can candidates do? Another level is from political parties. So should political parties, for example, be providing more support and resources for candidates? So we have 3 MPs here who are all experienced, smart, know this topic, but there are often people who are, for example, thinking about getting into politics where this might not be top of mind for them. And so we could think about whether the role of political parties there is to provide some resources and support for those who may have quite small campaigns or might not be thinking about this, or maybe entering into social media for the first time. Political parties might consider whether they want to create codes of conduct that MPs could all use together, could be discussed cross-partisan. So that's one other level, the political parties. And then there's the role of policymakers themselves. We've already started to touch on some things that can be done, whether it is clarifying existing laws and also police procedures to make sure that they are enforced evenly across candidates. So when we interviewed some people, we found that different candidates were having very different experiences when they contacted the police. There weren't clarified procedures that were actually consistent. So depending on how high profile you were, for example, that changed how the police reacted. So that's something that we might want to think about as well. Mm-hmm. And that we can also see one thing to get at what the question is saying, what is constructive conversation? Policymakers can think about promoting more transparency. One thing that Chris alluded to was that we could only look at Twitter and not at Facebook because of the various ways in which we were unable to access that data. And that's something where policymakers can help researchers by creating frameworks for transparency so that companies can't sort of point towards other types of laws to sometimes justifiably say that they can't give us access. And then finally, I'd say, of course, that the platforms play a big role here. They are, in a way, what I call content agnostic. This is what Bob Zimmer is referring to by saying that what they want is people to be on the platform as long as possible so that they can serve you more ads, right? And in essence, most of Facebook's money is made from serving you ads. So they're content agnostic. Whatever content keeps you on the platform, 2 thumbs up. And what we unfortunately see is that the kind of content that keeps people on there is things that make them angry, fearful, mostly negative emotions, which we know from long-standing psychological studies are the types of emotions that move people towards action. So we can think about then, what does it mean from a platform perspective to design for something different, to design for civility, to design for healthier conversations. And I'm happy to give more details, but I think it's a different way for platforms to think about what they're doing, not as ad tech, not as content agnostic, but as designing for civility.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a thorough answer, and I wish we had hours to unpack it. And we will, but just not today. Just a friendly reminder, if we could please pace our remarks out of consideration for the translators. Only so much knowledge can be processed at once. I have another question here from a member of the audience. Of whom there are actually about 500 right now, which is really fantastic because it's a lot cheaper to get a Zoom room for 500 people than to find a hall that fits them all. So thank you all for attending. It's one of the benefits of this terrible pandemic that we're in. And I'd like to put this to the members of Parliament. I'm not sure who wants to go first. That's poor moderation on my part, but alas, I can't decide. Is there a fear that the online abuse of politicians could lead to a Canadian version of what we saw in the United States on January the 6th? And this is something that I think is a very good question. I often say that the United States is not something that we should laugh at. It's a preview of a future that we can choose to avoid. That's a very abstract way of putting it. But what are your concerns about us going down that road? That was very scary. It continues to happen, and that's to Charlie's point, to Bob's point, Iqra's point. Everyone said, not just an attack on a person, but an attack on the legitimacy of people to participate in democracy at all if they disagree with you, and taking up arms effectively to try and shut down dissent. Are you concerned about something like that? Perhaps not in Canada exactly the same way. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Is there a Canadian version of this that we should be cautious of? That's the question from the floor, with a little bit of enhancement from me. So anyone who would like to take it, perhaps raise your hand. I'm sure each of you has something to add.
Yeah, I guess we are at risk of having something. We've had many protests on the Hill. We've seen protests, peaceful protests as large as 20,000. I think the Right to Life March is a yearly gathering that they're very peaceful. But we've also seen in 2014, somebody came in and wanted to do some of us in. So it's always there. I think, again, on my concern on the freedom aspect of it, one thing that we value in Parliament is that the public has access to us, because it's the public's place. It's their place that they've paid for, that they have elected us to go represent them in. So, that said, anything can happen in a negative way, but I would say we should do all what we can to preserve that place as it's meant to be. It's meant to be the center of our democracy, and even some of the limitations, even over COVID, not being able to attend in person. I think we really need to look into that. But anyway, concerned by what potentially can happen, but again, I think we should always err on the side of keeping that place the people's place.
Iqra Khalid, you've got your hand up. Are you concerned about incivility spiraling into violence in Canada? Perhaps not today, but at some point in future?
I think it was a couple of months ago when somebody rammed the gates of our Prime Minister's residence with a truck full of guns. And that ideology, the need to talk to our Prime Minister, came from somewhere. And we wonder how we got to that place. And I think what has happened down south really helps us to understand what the severe implications of the ability for certain groups to organize on social media platforms, what that can lead to. I remember in 2017 when a radio show or an IPTV show host had threatened to release my home address to people that were just not very happy with me. The fear is quite real. I mean, I don't live alone. There are young kids in my home. The fear is very, very real. And I think it is really incumbent for us to understand that and then to act on that for the preservation of what our democratic system is. I mean, ultimately, I would want more young women to enter into politics. I don't want them to fear for the safety of themselves or their friends or their own family because of the role that they're playing in our democratic system.
Thank you. Charlie, I just have a question for you on a
I was going to answer that question.
Okay, you go for it then. Go.
Well, because I think one of the really powerful things, and I want to echo what Bob Zimmer said, what makes me most proud about being a parliamentarian is that Parliament Hill is the people's hill. You go play Frisbee, you can yoga. People go and demonstrate without a permit all the time. I have been called over many times by the RCMP to ask if I could go and talk to some of the young people who are protesting. They said, hey, maybe you could just go talk to them, see what they're up to, so that they know who to contact. It's not that they're trying to shut it down, but they're trying to find a way to keep that open. I go to the UK, I don't see that. I go to Washington, I don't see that. I see what we have on Parliament Hill, and we need to protect that. Of course, we saw in 2014 with the horrific killing that we were not ready. We did not have the security measures to keep us safe. But to Madame Khalid's thing about, the threat, I'm very much more concerned about the threat right now to personal members of parliament or public figures. I had a situation this summer where someone on Facebook went from making a few cracks about me to a full-on heavy attack on me that lasted every single day for over 2 months. It was very public. It was very concerning. I was dealing with constituents every day who were very freaked out. And what I realized from that, because I just never thought that was going to happen to me, was that I didn't really have much support at Parliament. I was having to deal with the police. I was having to deal with the Crown Attorney's office. And when you're an ordinary citizen and you're dealing with a neighbor who's fighting with you over a fence and they go a little crazy, there are really heavy levels that you actually have to establish in order to get restraining orders and that. And I was trying to explain to police, and finally the police really got their heads around it. I said, I'm a public figure. And as a public figure, it's one of the privileges of Parliament that I cannot be intimidated from my work. I have an obligation to serve the people, and intimidation is a threat to the democratic rights, not of me, but of my constituents. Those rights are protected on Parliament Hill, where we have tons of police and security, but the vast majority of us do our work out in public. I drive to events by myself all the time. I don't have staff with me. I'm out by myself. So the need, I think, to have a conversation, and I've spoken with the Sergeant at Arms about this, about how, given the toxic level of threats, these attempts to arrest the Prime Minister, an attempt to arrest the leader of the New Democratic Party by someone who just tried to grab him on the street, the killing of Joe Cox, that we need to actually say, how do we have a better conversation with police, with Crown in the regions? Because what we face now is, when I got elected, these kind of things would never even been dreamed of, but now it's a possibility. And I think that that's the conversation. If we just have a better sense of what we would do in terms of dealing with individual threats, because my concern is that without that, one of our MPs or some provincial member will be a victim of someone doing something really wrong because they've been amped up or they're off, and we could have a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. It is a really concerning situation. I am inclined to agree with you. We've got just under 15 minutes left to go. And for those of you who probably have to nod off for your next meeting, I just want to thank those participants for coming here. I've been getting a lot of questions. Our Twitter feed @FriendsCB has been lighting up with questions. So if you'd like to keep up the conversation, please follow us there and send us a message, and we'd be glad to follow up with you. I know that there are a lot of policymakers on this call from various levels of government, provincial government. Well, I don't know who showed up, but at least they registered. And so we have a great degree of interest from people with a practical lens and who can potentially implement some solutions. Professor Tworek, Heidi, I wanted to just ask you a question and get you back in here. Charlie Angus just spoke about supports that can be available in Parliament for members of Parliament and people seeking political office, but people seeking office are not protected by Parliament. What recourse is available for people, especially as they relate to the platforms, to have this content against them and the people who are putting it up removed or censored or reported to police? We've heard many examples. Minister McKenna again said that Facebook refused to cooperate with the RCMP in telling who was threatening her life and her family, citing, and here I had to laugh, the privacy of the people involved. Yeah, says the company who paid $5 billion for lying about protecting people's privacy. And so there is a question of what recourse is available to individual people. They can sue in court perhaps, but that is a long process, which is very emotionally and financially expensive, unavailable to most people. How can people, absent larger regulatory reform, how do people stand up for themselves against this type of behavior? What has been your experience? And has the inability to do so prevented people from participating in public life in the first place?
Yeah, thanks. So there are, I think, multiple layers to that question. So I'll try and just unpack a few of them. The first is that every platform is a little bit different. So this is what researchers call affordances. What does the platform enable you to do? For example, block lists, muting people and so on and so forth. So Twitter versus Facebook versus TikTok, etc. Each one of them has different tools. So we've seen that in our interviews, different candidates and staff took quite different approaches, but often what would happen is that there would have to be a staff member or somebody else dealing with this. So one of the things that was problematic for candidates who had smaller staffs is then instead of spending your time with your constituents or having discussions, you're actually spending some of your staff time and emotional labor dealing with this. So that's one subset of the problem. And the other is that a lot of the tools may not be that helpful when you're really having a huge volume, because often, and these tools are evolving, but often it can take you a very long time to deal with a large volume. So that's another one of the problems. The other issue is one of where we are, which is that these platforms are ultimately, most of them, based in the United States. And what we see is that they're far more responsive to what happens in the US in terms of, for example, elections. So I'll just give you one example, which is that Twitter doesn't actually give a blue check to every political candidate within Canada, whereas they will do that for somewhere like the US. So Catherine McKenna's experience, if we think that she's very high profile, can potentially be mirrored by many, many others. For example, lots of MLAs, say in BC, also don't have a blue check, even though they're actually elected members of the Legislative Assembly. So that can mean that it just simply doesn't get as much attention because it's Canada versus somewhere else. We argue in the report a very basic thing, which is that elections in every country are important. And so we need to have much better communication so that if MPs do have these kind of problems, they get that kind of access to really understanding what's going on. But even beyond that, for ordinary people too. And then the final thing is the point you make about what happens when this gets really violent, what can possibly be done. And that's, I think, a place for policymakers to think about, as I've said, standardizing police procedures, what kind of education is needed so that the problems that Charlie Angus described don't recur. But also what needs to happen in terms of the data that is provided by platforms if this is indeed illegal content. So as you can see, there's multiple different layers of what needs to be done to think about these kinds of problems. They are complex, but at the moment they take up a lot of staff time, emotional labor, and also concern for the safety of some MPs as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. On the question of emotional labor, Bob Zimmer, I've got a question for you, and then I'd like to close with one last question, again, following up on a point that, that Heidi has just made. Your job is to serve your constituents, not to defend yourself online. And I agree that politicians have a right to operate free of this type of abuse, as does everybody, but I think political figures in particular. One way of dealing with this, of course, is blocking people. But a lot of people don't take kindly to that. I think that any act of blocking somebody by a politician is somehow violating democracy. I know you've been subject to this. The leader of the Bloc Québécois has been subject to blocking controversies, pun unavoidable. What do you what's your take on this, Bob?
Thanks for the question, and Charlie alluded to it earlier. The way that I would compare it to, because some say, well, you're a defender of free speech, so therefore you have to listen to me yell at you on the street corner. And I just would use the comparison of a physical interaction with somebody. If somebody was yelling at me in front of me and pointing me, poking me in the chest, I probably wouldn't stand there very long. And I'd say, look, if you want to talk further, just call my office or do it some other way. So some of the content, if ever I block somebody, I have a very similar standard to what Charlie says. If they're clearly not wanting to discuss an issue, they just want to either call me names and be rude or disrespectful. I used to be a teacher. I had a real simple rule that we had to respect each other in the classroom, and I have that same standard. If you're not going to have a respectful dialogue, then that's it. So, but it's different to say that that person that might be yelling at me should be arrested for it. If they're not harming me physically, I think that they should still have the freedom to get off their chest what they want to get off their chest. Again, as long as it's not harmful. Threatening my like the one tweet that I had here, I just wanted to mention, hey, Bob Zimmer, I wish Hamas had a better aim in 2014. Maybe it would have taught you and the Tories a lesson on imperialism. That was just one of many that we get. But I don't, that one almost crosses the line, I'd say. but ones that have maybe a controversial or rude opinion that I don't want to necessarily hear for the next 2 hours, I still don't think that person should be arrested for yelling at me. And there's a difference. So they have the freedom to do it. I just may not stand there and listen to them. There's a difference. We're talking about illegality and things and harmful to the person stuff here. And I think there's two, it's kind of apples and oranges to me. But that's, I know it's quite a thing. And I think every politician has probably had to block one or two people just with being offensive, frankly. So anyway, it's part of the job. Sadly, I know Iqra has referred to it already. You know, we want to have good people come into this political sphere from all parties. We want good people representing us, but it makes it really difficult when you have to run this gauntlet of social media.
I'll ask one last question, and I'll ask Iqra and Charlie to decide amongst themselves who wants to take it, just because we don't have very much time left. Heidi did allude to the fact that companies like Twitter and Facebook, for example, may behave differently towards the directives of authorities in the United States as opposed to in Canada or other countries. Charlie mentioned safe harbor provisions for those of you who are not plagued with the obligation to review the communications laws of the United States. This is a reference to legal philosophy in the United States that a company like Facebook, which is responsible for disseminating the speech of others, should not be held legally responsible for that speech. And there's a long history of why that is the case. In Canada, though, that was not the law until the recent trade deal has suggested that perhaps it might be. So we do have different standards. We do have different laws here than in the United States. What is it going to take for Canada to ensure that these companies comply with our laws and rules instead of imposing the laws and rules of their home jurisdiction, or which they deem convenient, onto us and the other way around? How can we regain sovereignty over our own political arena? That's going to be my last question for you.
Well, Facebook was found
so
guilty.
I guess I'll start.
Oh, sorry, Charlie got in there first, which means you got to be quick, Charlie, because Iqra's going to finish. Go ahead.
Okay, well,
Charlie.
I'll just go shortly. I mean, Facebook was found guilty by our privacy commissioner, and they said, "Thanks a lot. That's your opinion." Can you imagine a corporation ever before telling us, "Thanks for your opinion about breaking the laws," and there was no accountability? And we still haven't taxed Facebook. I mean, they don't pay tax in Canada, and they make an enormous amount of money. So I don't know why we keep wringing our hands about this. And like Bob, you know, Facebook has been enormously powerful for me in my region, isolated communities, people able to converse. I think it's a powerful platform. But the fact that they don't pay tax in this country is absurd. The fact that we still talk about it and how we're going to come up with legislation, we should just tax them like everybody else. End of story. You know, they break our laws, they have to pay fines. The idea that they can take us to court to fight our laws when we have a privacy commissioner, to me, is ridiculous. So end of story. We should just follow the rules.
I'm going to pass it to Iqra, but I'll just comment again. Kevin Chan, Facebook's representative in Canada, told Parliament 2 weeks ago that the company welcomes additional privacy legislation at the same time as they are fighting in court to say that our privacy commissioner has no jurisdiction over them. Another irony, contradiction of the company before Parliament. There seem to be many of them. Iqra Khalid, the last word falls to you. How can we regain sovereignty over our own political debate and the rules that govern it?
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I do want to reiterate a lot of what has been said. Absolutely, social media platforms need to be more responsible in the information that they disseminate. But we also, as a government, as a citizenry, need to understand the benefits of having that platform. For example, you know, for our national security, for our public safety, our ability to monitor the accounts that are public across the country has led us to being able to recognize terrorist organizations that are operating through these social media platforms. Does more need to be done? Absolutely. But does it need to be done with the ensuring that we can, and Canadians can still continue to benefit from having these platforms available to them? Absolutely. I think freedom of expression is a core value of what any democracy is. I think we need to continue to, and I know that our government is working on the ability to regulate and to hold social media companies to account beyond what is their profit lines, and to also take social responsibility for what occurs on their platforms as well. And that work is being done.
Great, thank you. This has been a fantastic event. We have answered a couple questions. We have presented a whole host more, but I think the urgency of the situation has been made very clear, and the fact that inaction is unacceptable has also been made clear. The impacts are indisputable. So I'd like to thank you. For those of you who wish to keep up the conversation in a civilized way, of course, you can do so by following us on Twitter at FriendsCB and messaging us that way, or you can visit us online at friends.ca. I would like to thank our guests, members of Parliament, Iqra Khalid, Charlie Angus, and Bob Zimmer for joining us. I would like to thank Chris Tenove and Heidi Tworek of the University of British Columbia for their excellent research and for rendering it into such perfect context for today's discussion. And I'd like to thank Adelina Petit-Vouriot from our partners at the Samara Centre for Democracy, not only for all the excellent work that they do every day, but also for helping us in this event. And finally, having spoken so quickly against my own injunction, to our translators today for their dutiful work and for putting up with my transgressions and those lesser transgressions of our panelists. That is all for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with each of you.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.